The Wild Witches and a Talisman, Part 4. The Wild Witches have taken Hollow Hill from the Hidden People. They've captured Sebastian and are holding him prisoner along with a boy named Jared. Tim, along with Jessica and her brother Simon, must rescue them by taking the talisman from the Wild Witches and giving it to Melinda so that she can work her magic. The problem is that only Jessica can enter Hollow Hill. Armed with an invisibility potion, Jessica must find the talisman and rescue Sebastian and Jared before it's too late. And now, the final part of The Wild Witches and the Talisman. Jessica looked at the door she'd just come through. It was not made of wood on this side, it was made of stone. There was no cat showing. It looked just like the other stones in the wall, except it was bigger. No one would know there was a door there. There was a wooden door on the far side of the room. It had two bolts like the door from the secret tunnel, but the bolts were pulled back. Jessica tiptoed over to it. She lifted the catch and opened the heavy wooden door as softly as she could. She looked out into the passage beyond it. The passage ran to her right and to her left. It was lined with stones, like the secret tunnel she'd just come through. Every 3 yards, there was a little stone shelf set into the wall of the passage. Lanterns stood on the shelves, so that Jessica could see quite well, although there were dark patches of shadow too. She listened. There was no sound at all. Jessica opened her anorak. She put her hand under her sweater and pulled out the finding stone. It felt very queer. She couldn't see her hands or her feet, and she had to open her anorak by feeling it because she couldn't see her clothes. But as soon as she pulled the finding stone clear of her sweater, she saw it as if it was hanging in mid-air. It pulled at her fingers as if it was trying to move. Jessica flattened her hand and laid the finding stone on it. The stone moved slowly round till it was pointing along the passage to her right. There was no sign of gold on the stone. It was still a deep red. Jessica pushed the finding stone back under her sweater and it disappeared. She set off along the passage. She ran along by the wall and every few yards she stopped and listened. She had not gone very far when she came to a flight of stone steps leading out of a passage to her left. The passage itself went on into the hill. Jessica pulled out the finding stone and set it on the palm of her hand again. This time the stone pointed to the steps. She put the finding stone away and began to climb up them. She had climbed for some time when the steps turned sharply to the right. She stood still for a moment listening. She could hear voices above her. The voices sounded like old doors creaking in the wind. She couldn't hear what anyone was saying, but she knew that she must be listening to the witches. There was a little stone landing in front of her. There was a lantern on the landing, and more stairs led upward to the far side. To her right, Jessica saw an archway leading to a little room. She was just going to pull out the finding stone when she heard a clatter on the stairs above. Someone was coming down. Quick as a flash, she slipped across the landing and into the little room. She just stood inside the archway. She flattened herself against the wall and waited. Shoes clattered down the stairs and across the landing to the archway, and a witch came into the room. It was all Jessica could do to stop herself crying out. The witch was dressed in a long dark green skirt with a long red cloak hanging from her shoulders. She was wearing a tall pointed hat and her eyes were black and very bright. She had a long hooked nose and a long hooked chin, and some of her teeth were missing. The witch was just going to cross the room when she stopped and held her head on one side, listening. Jessica scarcely dared to breathe. The witch turned round suddenly as if she expected to catch someone watching her, but Jessica was invisible. The witch looked straight at her and saw nothing but the wall of the room. The witch went back to the archway and looked up and down the stairs, and she came back into the middle of the room again. A dark red curtain hung across the far corner near a lantern. The witch walked across to it. Jessica could hear her muttering to herself. "No one there, no one there," she muttered. "No one in the room, no one on the stair, no one there, no one there. And why do I feel it in my bones that someone's standing on the stones?" She swung round suddenly. Jessica held her breath. The witch gave a quick look round and shook her head, and then she turned to the curtain again and pulled it back. A big red plate was standing on a shelf behind the curtain. The witch picked it up and went out of the room and up the stairs, carrying the plate carefully in both hands. It was made of some kind of metal, and there were strange signs painted on it. Jessica let out a breath. Her heart was beating wildly. She stood still for a moment, taking deep breaths, and then with shaking hands, she pulled out the finding stone and went on to the landing. The stone pointed up the stairs. It was still deep red, but it shone with a very faint golden light. Jessica swallowed. She pushed the stone back under the sweater, took another deep breath, and went up the stairs as quietly as she could. She could hear voices about her now. There were witches' voices and strange whistles. She heard the clatter of plates, and she could smell smoke from a fire. Then she saw more light above her. The stone stairs ended in a room, and the witches were there. She saw one sweep past the top of the stairs as she looked upwards. Jessica crept quietly up the stairs until she could see into the room above. It was a very big room. Lanterns hung from the stone roof, and there were steps at one end leading up to a gallery, and then up still higher into the hill. There was a wood fire and a big fireplace at the other end of the room, with a big black pot hanging on a chain over it. There was a long table down the middle of the room, and 3 lanterns stood on the table. But Jessica scarcely looked at the room. She only looked at the witches. There were 7 witches in the room. 6 of them were sitting round the table eating. Jessica stood still, staring. The witches were all wearing their tall pointed hats and their long red cloaks. They were eating some kind of meat and gnawing the bones which they held in their hands. Every now and then they drank something out of black mugs that stood on the table. Some of them were old with white hair, but some looked quite young. One of them would have been beautiful except for her eyes, which made her look so fierce that for a moment they made Jessica feel afraid. Then she remembered the witches couldn't see her, and her courage came back. The 7th witch was the one who had just come up the stairs with a red plate. She went to the head of the table. The other 6 witches finished eating and threw the bones onto the floor. The 7th witch held the red plate out in front of her. At once, all the witches were silent. They sat there quite still, looking at the 7th witch. "I have a feeling in my bones," said the 7th witch slowly. She dropped the words out as if they were pebbles falling into the water. "I have a feeling in my bones. Someone is standing on the stones. Danger is coming." "A cold wind is blowing from the stairs," said another witch. "I can feel my hair lifting." They turned and stared at Jessica, but they saw nothing. "It is time to ask the hidden one," said the 7th witch. "I have bought the magic plate. I will pour the red fire over it." She set the red plate on the table in front of her. One of the younger witches got up and went to a little door in the wall. She opened it and took out a glass bowl full of a red liquid. She carried the bowl over to the 7th witch and set it on the table in front of her. She went back to the cupboard in the wall and carried 3 big grey stones one at a time and set them on the table close together. Then she went back to her place. None of the other witches moved or spoke. Everything seemed to have changed. At one moment they'd been eating and drinking and talking. Now they were ready for magic. Jessica shivered. They couldn't see her, but she knew they felt someone was there, just as she did herself when the hidden people were about. She didn't like the way they kept looking towards the stone steps where she was standing. Very softly, she crept up the last few steps into the room. She crept along the wall, keeping as far away from the witches as she could, not making a sound. She climbed the steps up into the gallery at the end of the room. She felt safer up there. There were more steps leading upwards, and a passage opened out at one end of the gallery, so she knew that she wouldn't be trapped. She stood at the rail, looking down into the room. The 7th witch had lifted the bowl up off the table. She held it high over her head and said something in words Jessica didn't understand. Then she poured the red liquid onto the red plate. The liquid sparkled and glowed like red fire, and for a few moments a great cloud of red mist rose up from the plate and filled the room, blotting out everything. Then it cleared away, and Jessica saw the witches still standing silently round the table. None of them had moved. The 3 grey stones had turned red. The 7th witch looked at the 3 red stones standing on the table. Hidden one, speak from the stones. What is the danger we feel in our bones?" she cried. There was a silence, and then a voice came out of the 3 stones on the table. It sounded like the wind blowing through a crack in the door. But Jessica could hear the words. "An enemy is within the hill." "I knew it," cried the 7th witch.
What enemy is this?"
"An enemy who you cannot see," said the voice from the stones. "An enemy comes to set prisoners free, to take the thing you value most. Without the talisman, you are lost." The witches all gave a wild cry and leapt to their feet.
"Fetch the talisman!" cried the seventh witch. "Fetch the talisman, bring it here that we may guard it. Then we will go and turn our prisoners into stone. They shall never be free. If we cannot see our enemy, we can still save the talisman and hold our prisoners. Fetch the talisman, Grey Grindle."
One of the witches started across the room towards the stairs leading up to the gallery. Jessica ran along the passage, pulling out the finding stone as she ran. It was glowing with a golden light and pointing in front of her. She heard the witch coming behind her. She turned a corner and the passage opened up into a little room. There was no door to the room. A little casket stood on the table on the far side. The finding stone pointed to the casket and glowed in her hand. It had turned gold. As Jessica ran towards the casket, the witch came into the room behind her. The witch saw the golden finding stone and let out a cry of rage. She leapt forward. Jessica pushed the finding stone under her sweater, sprang to one side and crouched down on the floor. The witch stopped. She stood still, listening. Jessica held her breath. The witch looked all around the room. Jessica didn't move. The witch suddenly flung out an arm, but it didn't touch Jessica. The witch stood still for a moment, with her head on one side, listening for any sound. But Jessica was as still as stone. Suddenly, the witch picked up a casket, went out of the door. Jessica stood up. She had missed a chance. The witches had the talisman, and they knew that someone was after it. What was she to do now? She followed the witch out of the room back to the gallery and stood there watching while the witch took the casket down the stairs and set it in the centre of the table.
"There is someone here," she cried. "Someone is trying to steal the talisman. I saw a magic finding stone hanging in the air by the casket. Some enemy is here, and that enemy is invisible." "Stand and guard that casket," cried the seventh witch. "No enemy shall take it from us."
The witches all stood up round the table, holding out their cloaks to make a wall around the casket. Jessica slipped softly down the stairs. Her heart was beating wildly, but she made no noise. A flask of wine stood on a shelf at one end. The witches were all looking at the casket fearfully, as if they expected it to vanish. Quickly, Jessica picked up the flask of wine and threw it back towards the gallery. It fell to the ground with a crash. At once, the witches turned to see what the noise was, and the witch nearest to Jessica dropped her arms for a moment. Quick as a flash, Jessica slipped through the gap in the witches' cloaks, seized the casket with the talisman, and leapt backwards, pushing it under her sweater. The steps leading downwards were only a few feet away. She ran across to them and leapt down them 2 or 3 steps at a time towards a passage below. There was a wild howl from the witches, then she heard them tumbling down the steps behind her. But they all rushed after at once and jammed the stairway. It gave her a few moments' start as they fell down the stairs, tumbling over each other and crying out with rage and pain. Jessica found herself at the bottom of the stairs and turned right along the passage. Behind her, the witches reached the foot of the stairs and set off after her. They couldn't see her, but they could hear her footsteps. Jessica fled along the passage, clasping the casket to her. She came to the door of a little room which led to the secret tunnel. She had left the door open. She dashed through it, set the casket down for a moment, and slammed the door. She shot the bolts into place. She was just in time. A moment later, and the witches were hammering on the door. Jessica's breath came in great sobs of excitement and fear. She pulled out the finding stone. It was clear gold now and glowing with a bright golden light. She held the finding stone out in her hand. She struck the casket with it. The casket broke in pieces. A beautiful little golden flute, scarcely twice as long as her hand, lay there on the stones. The blows of the witches on the door suddenly sounded loud as if they had a cudgel or an iron bar. The bolts were beginning to give way. With shaking hands, Jessica pulled the red velvet bag from the rope around her waist. She opened it, took out the golden cloth, and wrapped the little flute in it as the witches pounded louder and louder on the door. She pushed the talisman, all carefully wrapped in the golden cloth, into the velvet bag. There was a crack behind her. One of the bolts had broken. Jessica rushed over to the great stone in the far wall and knocked. The door swung open and there was Tim. "Be quick," gulped Jessica, half falling into the passage. "Shut the door, the witches are after me." Tim swung the door to and shut the bolts. "Jessica," he said, "Jessica, are you here in the passage? Are you all right?" "Have you got the talisman?" said Simon. "Where's Sebastian and where are you?" "I'm here," gasped Jessica. She stood still for a moment, trying to get her breath back. "I haven't got Sebastian," she whispered at last. Her voice wouldn't come properly. "I haven't seen Sebastian and I haven't seen Jared, but I've got the talisman." She put the red velvet bag down on the stone where they could see it and stepped back. "There it is," she said. "We must get it to Melinda quickly," said Tim. "She'll use it to help Sebastian." Jessica saw him look towards her. "You're only just in time, Jessica," he said. "I think I can see you. You look like a shadow, but you're there." Jessica looked down at her hands. She could see the outline of the fingers. As she looked, her hands darkened and she could no longer see the stones through them. She suddenly felt her knees shaking and sat down on a big stone by the door. "You take the talisman," she whispered to Tim, handing him the velvet bag. "It's quite safe. It's all wrapped up in the golden cloth. I'll have to go back for Sebastian. The witches won't wait. They'll turn him into stone. I heard them say so." "You can't go back yet," said Tim. "You're shaking too much and you're not invisible anymore." "I'll be all right," whispered Jessica. "I've got to save Sebastian. I've got to." "You take this to Melinda and I'll go and look for Sebastian," said Tim. Jessica shook her head. "I've still got some of the magic drink," she whispered. "I can go back without them seeing me. I'll be invisible again. They would see you. They'll be looking all over Hollow Hill for me. They don't know I've got away, or at least, I think they don't." The door into the passage looks just like a stone in the wall. You wouldn't be invisible, don't you remember? "Then Simon can take the talisman back and I'll wait here for you," said Tim. Jessica shook her head. "You must both go," she whispered. "Simon can't manage the boat on his own, nor can you. It's too heavy. You must make sure that Melinda gets the talisman. That's the most important thing." She could still scarcely speak, but she was beginning to get her breath back. "Then you better come with us too," said Tim. "We'll all go back. Melinda said she could drive off the wild witches if she had the talisman. Sebastian will be all right." "No, he won't," said Jessica. "There won't be time. The witches said they were going to turn their prisoners into stone. That's what they'll do when they guess I've escaped. Look, they're very angry. They'll do it out of spite. I must go back and get Sebastian. And there's the boy too, Jared. I can't leave them there with the wild witches. They're so angry, they might do anything." Tim was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, he sounded very unhappy. "All right," he said. "If you think you can find them, you'd better go back. We'll get the talisman to Melinda as quickly as we can. But remember, if things get very bad, if the witches do catch you, you can always throw away the silver coin. If you do that, they'll all vanish. Witches, hidden people, the lot of them. You won't be able to see them anymore, but they won't be able to hurt you." "Melinda would vanish too," said Jessica, "and I'd still be lost in Hollow Hill." "We'd come and find you," said Tim. "I'd still be able to see Melinda. We'd get you out." "But you won't have to," said Jessica. "They won't catch me. But don't bolt the door this time. Then I can get out myself. The witches can't get through the silver curtain, so they can't get down the passage, even if they do find the door." "All right," said Tim. "I think the door will stay shut on its own." "Then I'll go," said Jessica, getting up. "Are you sure?" asked Tim. Jessica nodded. "Have a look into the room before you open the door," said Tim. "There may be witches there. We found a spy hole while we were waiting for you. Look." He put the velvet bag on the ground and stepped on up to the stone near the door where Jessica had been sitting and pulled a long, thin iron spike out of the wall near his head. He looked through the hole left by the spike. Then he stepped down again and whispered, "Have a look. I think they've gone." Jessica looked through the hole. The room looked empty, but she couldn't see the part nearest to her. "I'll go now," she whispered. She pulled out the little bottle, unscrewed the cap, and drank what was left of the blue liquid. Tim slid the bolts back, and the door swung open. Jessica was just going to step through when a witch leapt up from the floor by the wall with a wild cry. "Get back to the curtain!" cried Jessica. Tim grabbed the velvet bag and leapt down the stone steps with Simon at his heels. Jessica hid behind the secret door. The witch clambered into the secret passage and stumbled down the steps. but she was too late. Tim swung the silver curtain to one side, and he and Simon slipped through. As the witch got to the foot of the steps, the curtain swung back into place. The witch turned with a cry of rage and began to climb the steps towards the room. Jessica looked down at her own hands. She couldn't see them. She was invisible again. She slipped round the door ahead of the witch and into the little room. She crossed over the room into the passage just as 3 other witches came running along towards the door. She flattened herself against the wall, and the 3 witches tore past her without knowing she was there. She heard cries of rage coming from the little room as they went in and saw the open secret door into the tunnel. Jessica didn't wait. She set off along the passage as fast as she could. As she got to the stairs leading up to the big hall, 3 more witches came scurrying down and then set off along the passage towards the little room. Angry cries were still coming from the witches by the secret door. Jessica drew a deep breath. At least she knew where the witches were, and they didn't know that she was in Hollow Hill. They must think she'd escaped with Simon and Tim. They could see Simon and Tim, but they hadn't seen her. She had half an hour in which to find Jared and Sebastian. Trouble was, but she didn't know how they were going to get out when she found them, and she didn't know where to look. She would have to search Hollow Hill, and there wasn't much time. She set off past the stairs along the passage. There were rooms off to the right and to the left. She opened the doors into each of them, but they were all empty. She came to a very large room at the end of the passage, but that was empty too. The prisoners must be somewhere higher up. She ran back to the stairs and climbed up into the big hall. The remains of the witch's supper still stood on the table. There was a door at the end of the passage. She opened it and saw a flight of stone steps leading down through the rock. The steps were lit by lanterns standing on stone shelves. Jessica ran quickly down the steps and came to another door. It opened into a passage cut through the rock. An old ladder was propped against a rock wall opposite her. There was a great boulder to her right forming the end of the passage, but there were no doors in the rock anywhere, so she went back up the steps again. She just got back into the hall when she heard some of the witches coming up the stone stairs. She ran across the steps and climbed up to the gallery. She looked down. 3 witches came up into the hall below her. There was a 7th witch and Grey Grindle, the youngest witch, the one with the fierce eyes. They went over to the table and sat down at one end of it. "Wickle will see that no one uses that door," said Grey Grindle, "but the talisman has gone. Who knows what trouble will come upon us now?" The 7th witch had seated herself at the head of the table. "It may be that we have to leave Hollow Hill," she said, "but we will fight them while we can. At least they shall not have any prisoners back. That will be 2 of them less to fight. Get me a bowl of the magic fire, Grey Grindle, and I'll pour it over the carved stick. Then we will touch them with the stick and turn them into stone." "Let me do it," cried the witch with the fierce eyes. The 7th witch croaked with a kind of laugh. "You shall carry the stick up the stair," she said, "but we will come with you. Get me the fire, Grey Grindle." As Grey Grindle got up to get a bowl of magic fire, Jessica ran up the stairs that led from the gallery. The 7th witch had said that the stick would be carried up the stair. That must mean that prisoners were somewhere up above her. She came to the top of the stairs and found herself at the end of the passage. Again there were doors on each side, but the doors stood open, and at the end of the passage there was one more door, and that door was closed. It had heavy bolts on it, on the side that Jessica could see, and the bolts were firmly in place. She ran quickly down the passage to the door. She slipped the bolts back and stepped into the room, pulling the door to behind her. A boy was sitting on a stool on the far side of the room, and Sebastian was sitting on his knee. They both looked up in surprise as the door opened and Jessica came in. Jessica remembered that she was invisible. "Sebastian," she cried, "it's Jessica. You can't see me. Melinda has made me invisible, but I've come to help you escape." Sebastian jumped down and ran towards her. Jessica almost sobbed with relief. Sebastian remembered her. He hadn't been touched by the talisman. "I can't see you," said the boy. You're not a ghost, are you? I can see the wall through you, but I can't see you." Jessica looked down at her hand. She could see the outline of her fingers, and they thickened as she looked. Sebastian rubbed himself against her leg. He was purring hard.
I've been so long trying to find you, the spell must have worn off, said Jessica. The witches will be able to see me too, but they'll be able to see you anyway. It doesn't matter now. We've got to get away. Do you know how to get out of the hill? Jared shook his head. They brought us in by a big rock, he said. It rolled back, and there was the opening into the hill. They shut it by rolling the rock back again, but I don't know where it is or how they made the rock move. They covered my eyes and turned me round and round as soon as I was inside the hill. Then we'll have to hide somewhere where the witches can't find us until Melinda can work her spell, said Jessica. She's got the talisman, at least I hope she has. Tim's taking it back to her. We only have to hide till she can use it. Quick, we must find somewhere else to hide. She ran to the door and opened it. She slipped through and Sebastian and Jared followed. Jared pushed the door to and shot the bolts back into place. We won't let them know how we escaped, he said. They'll think we left by magic. They ran along the passage. They nearly reached the gallery when they heard the witches coming up the stairs ahead of them. Sebastian ran through an open door into one of the side rooms. Jessica and Jared ran in after him. There were some scarlet cloaks hanging from pegs along one wall. The cloaks came right down to the stone floor. The three of them ran across the room and hid behind the cloaks. The cloaks smelt of wood smoke and a strange, thick smell, which Jessica had never smelt before. It was a horrible smell, and she could only just breathe. They heard the witches pass down the passage. They heard the bolts pulled back on the door of the room where Jared and Sebastian had been prisoners, and then they heard the cries of rage. A minute later, the witches stormed down the passage outside. Jessica put her eye to a crack of light between the cloaks. She saw Grey Grindle look into the room where they were hiding, but the witch was in a great hurry, and she didn't see them. She rushed on after the others. They heard the witches clatter down the stairs into the hall. I expect they've gone down to the room where the secret tunnel comes in, Jessica whispered. They'll know someone went out that way. They'll try and stop us reaching the passage. Sebastian gave a little purr and moved out to the side room. Jessica and Jared pushed their cloaks to one side and stood listening. You must go that way if you can and take Sebastian, said Jared. I can hide somewhere in the hill. I'll find the way out somewhere. Jessica shook her head. I'll never get out that way now that the witches can see me, she said. Sebastian gave a little purr and ran to the door. He looked back over his shoulder. I think Sebastian knows the way, cried Jared. Come on, we'll follow Sebastian. Sebastian gave a long purr as if he was very pleased. They went to the doorway and looked out. Then he looked back at them, waved his tail, and went out into the passage. Come on, said Jared. Jessica and Jared crossed over to the door and looked up and down the passage outside. The passage was empty except for Sebastian. He was standing a little way along it towards the gallery waiting for them. As soon as he saw them, he purred again and ran down the steps and into the gallery. He looked back at them over his shoulder. Jessica and Jared followed him quickly. Sebastian waited for them in the gallery, and they all three crept forward very quietly and looked down into the hall. There was no one there. The table stood in the middle, still littered with the remains of a witch's feast. The lanterns hung from the roof. They could hear sounds coming from below, but no one was coming up the stairs. Sebastian ran down into the room, and they followed him. He went round the table to the door on the far side. Jessica suddenly remembered a great rock at the bottom of the stone steps, which she'd seen when she was looking for Sebastian. I think I know where he's going, she whispered to Jared. He's taking us to the great rock. It must be the way out of the hill. Come on, said Jared. Quickly, I can hear someone coming. They ran down the wooden stairs into the hall and slipped round the table to the door. Jessica heard a clatter on the stone steps leading up to the hall. It sounded like one of the witches. She pulled the door open. They all slipped through and closed it behind them. Look, said Jared. There's a key in the lock. A key was sticking out of the keyhole on their side of the door. He turned the key quickly and the lock slid into place. He wasn't a moment too soon. The handle of the door turned and someone tugged it from the other side. They heard the witch's cry of rage through the door and answering cries from the other witches below. They fled down the passage to the stairs and tore down them 2 or 3 steps at a time, with Sebastian leading the way. Jared flung open the wooden door at the bottom of the stairs and they tumbled into the big passage. There was a great rock filling the big passage to their right. It's the way out, cried Jared. It's the way out of the hill. But how do we roll the rock back, panted Jessica. I don't know what to do.
"Nor do I," said Jared, "but Sebastian does, look." Sebastian had run to the old ladder on the far side of a passage. He was climbing up it quickly, jumping from the rung to rung, his claws gripping the wood. Jared and Jessica could see a silver ring in the rock above him. Sebastian got to the top rung of a ladder and jumped. He landed on the ring. The ring fell slowly down towards them, with Sebastian clinging to it. As he fell, it pulled a thin silver chain out of the wall behind it. As the ring moved downwards towards the ground, the great rock boulder rolled slowly back, and they saw the moon shining down on the grass and the trees outside. There was a wild cry from the other end of the passage behind them. Jessica looked round. The witches were there. They'd come down from some other way through the hill. They were rushing towards them. For a second, Jessica stood, quite still, frozen with fear. Then she leapt out through the open doorway after Jared and Sebastian. There was a pile of broomsticks outside lying on the grass where the witches had tossed them down. Sebastian rushed over to them. He leapt onto one of the broomsticks and twitched his tail. The broomstick lifted into the air. Jared and Jessica flung themselves onto it, and they were off, rushing through the cold night wind towards the canal. The air was filled with wild cries and strange whistles as the witches rushed to the broomsticks behind them. Jessica looked back. The seventh witch was already in the air, rushing after them. "Faster, Sebastian, faster!" she cried. Sebastian waved his tail wildly. It was easy to see that he was already flying as fast as he could. "We've only got to get to the canal," said Jared. "The witches haven't got the talisman now. They can't cross the water." "She'll catch us first," Jessica half whispered, half sobbed, as she looked back again. The seventh witch was nearly upon them, and the others were streaming after her. She reached her hands forward to be ready to seize a broomstick. "No!" Jessica cried. "No!" How far was it to the canal? It was so near now. Jessica turned and glanced quickly forward towards the dark trees. The sound of music blew towards them on the wind. It was the strangest tune Jessica had ever heard. It seemed to come from very far away. It made her think of water falling in the sunlight onto rock pools and seabirds crying over the waves. And yet it sounded like a tune blown by the wind through the reeds. Suddenly Jessica no longer felt afraid. The music had taken all her fear away. She looked back and gave a cry. "The witches!" she cried. "Look, Jared, look! The witches are changing into mist. Melinda has used the talisman." Sebastian swung the broomstick round in a half circle and held it still in the air, hovering above the ground. All three of them stared towards Hollow Hill. The witches had swept high into the air in a great circle above them, but they no longer looked like the wild witches who had poured out of the hill. They were grey, and their cloaks looked as thin as spiders' webs. Jessica could see the stars through them. As they watched, the witches slowly faded into a grey mist. They were blown together by the wind until they were just a little cloud in the moonlight. Then a great cold gust of wind shook Sebastian's broomstick. The music rang out loudly in Jessica's ears, and the cloud was gone. The music died away. The wind dropped. The sky was clear. The fields and trees below them were silent under the moon. Sebastian slowly turned the broomstick round and headed for the canal. As they flew over the water, Jessica saw people waiting for them on the far side. Melinda was there with Tim and Simon. Captain Jory stood beside her, and there were strange men and women with him. The broomstick glided down and pulled up with a jerk in front of Melinda. Jared and Jessica tumbled off, and Sebastian jumped down. Simon was dancing up and down with delight. Jess, you made it! You did it!" he cried. Sebastian took a flying leap into Tim's arms. One of the women rushed over to Jared and hugged him as if she would never let him go. Jessica looked at her, and the thought of her own mother flooded into her mind. If only she were there too. But she would never be there again. The fear and excitement of the last few hours had been all that Jessica could bear. This last little thing was too much for her. Jessica burst into tears. Melinda stepped forward and put a comforting arm around her shoulders. Jessica turned towards her and buried her face in Melinda's shawl. I'm sorry, she sobbed. There's no need to be sorry, child, said Melinda. Tim glanced at her in surprise. He'd never heard Melinda's voice so kind. There's no need to be sorry, she said. You have done well. You have saved Jared and Sebastian. You have brought the talisman out of Hollow Hill, and all the wild witches couldn't stop you. You've earned the right to cry. It'll do you good. Jessica swallowed hard and wiped her eyes on Melinda's shawl. "You have made many friends tonight, Jessica," said Melinda. "Tim and Jared and Sebastian will always be your friends now, and so shall I, and the hidden people from the mound. We shall never forget what you did tonight, and whenever you need us, we shall be there." Jared's mother, Jessica knew that a strange woman must be his mother, came across to her and kissed her forehead. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. Jessica could tell that she was too full of happiness to speak. She looked across at Tim and he smiled at her. "Good old Jess," he said. She managed to smile back. "Come to my house," said Melinda. "Soon we must have a great feast in the hill to celebrate this night. All the hidden people from Hollow Hill will want to see you and thank you, all three of you. But Tim and Simon have been part of this too. But we must not celebrate now, that comes later. The night is nearly over and you must be going. But come back to my house first. I have something for you all. Then Tobias and Sebastian will take you home." Jared left his mother and came over to Jessica. "Good night, Jessica," he said. "I'll see you again soon, and I'll never forget what you did tonight." Jessica managed to smile at him too, but she still couldn't trust herself to speak. But Jared seemed to understand that. The hidden people all moved quietly away in the moonlight and disappeared in the dark shadows under the trees. Melinda, Jessica, Tim and Simon walked slowly back along the path by the canal towards Melinda's house. Jessica walked close to Melinda, with Melinda's arms still around her. She felt happier than she'd felt for weeks. They didn't talk, but they could all hear Sebastian purring loudly as he rode on Tim's shoulder. When they got to Melinda's house, they found Tobias waiting on the doorstep. He looked at Sebastian and shook his head. "You're not much of a strange one, are you?" he said to Sebastian in a disapproving tone. "Getting yourself caught by wild witches. I should have thought that any son of mine would have had more sense than that." Sebastian gave a little protesting mew, and Tim scratched him under the chin. "You leave Sebastian alone, Tobias," he said. "Of course I'll leave him alone," said Tobias. "He's big enough and old enough to look after himself. But I did think he had more sense." "Come inside," said Melinda. "The night is nearly over. I have some presents to give you and then you must go." She opened the door and they went inside. The fire was burning brightly. The silver bowls stood on the table and there were glass jars and bottles full of strange coloured powders and liquids standing beside it. Jessica could see that Melinda had been working magic. Melinda drew out a package wrapped in golden cloth from under a shawl and set it down in the bowl. "The talisman can rest here for tonight," she said quietly. "Tomorrow I shall take it to a safer place where the wild witches will never find it." She went over to a cupboard in the wall. "I have something here for each of you," she said. She handed Simon a little owl made out of ivory. "Keep it safe, Simon, for it is magic," she said. "The owl is made from magic ivory. If you stand him in the moonlight when the moon is full, he will fly. Let him go and he will come back to you before daylight." She turned to Tim and gave him a silver whistle. "This will call Sebastian, Tim," she said. "If you blow this, you will hear nothing yourself, but Sebastian will hear it. No matter how far away he is, he will hear the sound and come to you." Melinda turned back to the cupboard and took out a carved wooden box. It was very old. The wood was almost black, and there was a wooden bird standing on the lid, with its wings spread open. "This is for you, Jessica," she said. "Open it." Jessica took the box and opened the lid. There was nothing inside it, but as soon as she opened the lid, a tune began to play. It was the same tune she had heard blown on the wind when the wild witches had turned into mist. She looked up at Melinda in surprise. Melinda smiled at her. "If you ever think there are wild witches about, lift the lid of the box and the tune will play," said Melinda. "When the tune is played, the wind will come and the witches will be blown away on the wind. I have made the magic for this box with the talisman. Keep it by you and you never need be afraid of wild witches again. The finding stone is yours to keep too. Its work is done." They tried to thank Melinda for their gifts, but she wouldn't let them say anything. "You have given me a gift tonight that is more than anything I can give you," said Melinda. "You have given me the talisman. I have given you these things because gifts are a sign of friendship. Tim has been a friend of the hidden people for a long time. Now Jessica and Simon are friends too. Take the gifts. You have earned them tonight. And now you must go home." As they went outside, they could see the stars were fading. The sky was growing pale in the east. 2 broomsticks lay beside the path. Tobias jumped on one and Sebastian on the other. Tim climbed onto Tobias's broomstick as before. Jessica was glad of that. Tobias was very much one of the hidden people. Sebastian was much friendlier. She sat down on the broomstick behind him, holding a box tightly. Simon sat down too. "Good night and fare you well," cried Melinda as the brooms rose up into the air. "I shall see you again before long, when we're all feasting together with the hidden people in Hollow Hill." "Good night," they cried. "Good night, Melinda." The wind blew the hair back as Sebastian and Tobias flew up high over the canal. They were flying very fast and straight back to the yard. There was no need to keep away from Hollow Hill now. Jessica soon saw the first streets of the town below her. A pale grey light was beginning to creep over the houses when the broomstick swept down into the yard and stopped outside Jessica's window. Jessica and Simon both climbed in. "Good night, Sebastian. I'll see you tomorrow," Jessica whispered, leaning out of the window. "You'll see him today, you mean?" said Simon. "It's nearly morning." Sebastian leapt onto the windowsill and onto Jessica's shoulder. He left the broomstick hovering in the air outside. He pushed his nose right up under her chin and rubbed himself against her. Then he gave a little purr, jumped back onto the windowsill and out onto the broomstick. The broomstick shot across the yard to Tim's window, where Tobias was just leaving. They saw Sebastian ride the broomstick through the open window right into Tim's room. Tim looked out. He saw them at the window and waved. Then he shut the window and disappeared. "Whoa," said Simon. "What a night! What a marvellous, fantastic, exciting night!" "It was a bit too exciting," said Jessica. "You were fantastic, Jess, you really were," said Simon. "And just think what will happen now. All the hidden people are our friends. We can ride broomsticks all over the place. We'll have a midnight feast in Hollow Hill. I'm sure that's what Melinda meant when she talked about celebrating. There are all kinds of things we can do now." "Well, I know what I'm going to do now," said Jessica. "I'm going to go to bed. And so are you. I'm so tired I can scarcely stand." "Yeah, see you in about an hour's time then," said Simon. "But I don't know how you can sleep, Jess. It's been fantastic." "Oh, I can sleep all right," said Jessica. "I can't stay awake." Simon laughed and went off to his own room. Jessica set the carved box down on the little table by her bed. She got into her pyjamas and climbed into bed. She was very tired, but she felt a strange kind of happiness too, and there was nothing to be afraid of now. She put out a hand and lifted the lid of the box. The strange music swept over her. She knew the box was playing the music, and yet the tune seemed to come from far away, her mind filled with the music. The tune came to an end. Jessica put out her hand and shut the lid. She pulled the blankets up over her shoulders and stole down under the bedclothes. In the house across the yard, Tim lit a candle on the table by his bed. He didn't want to put the light on. He took the silver whistle out of his pocket and slipped it under his pillow. "You'll have to come now when I whistle, Sebastian," he said. Sebastian purred loudly and rubbed himself against Tim's legs. Then, as Tim put on his pyjamas and climbed into bed, Sebastian jumped up beside him, still purring. "I hope there won't be any more wild witches about," said Tim, stroking him. "You keep away from them if there are, Sebastian." "Her?" said Sebastian as he settled down on the bed. "There's something will happen even if it isn't with the wild witches," Tim said to himself. "Melinda wouldn't to give me this whistle unless she thought I might need it." Sebastian's purr changed to a snore. Tim laughed. He blew out the candle, and a minute later he was asleep.